Good afternoon and welcome to The Hard Truth. I'm Dr. Brent Turvey, and as always, I'm here with forensic investigator Melanie Ingles. Today, we're going to be joined by my good friend and colleague, Aurelio Coronado. I'm getting a reverb here. Hold on one second. I'm getting a reverb. Let me close this. Quit. There we go. All right. Today, we're going to talk about death investigation. And we are three people, but each one of us represents experiences in three different countries. And the reason I invited Aurelio today is because I did some work last week, and I had a conversation with Melanie this morning explaining to her what we did in a couple of cases last week. And I had a revelation. And this revelation is about the disconnect that exists between the forensic science efforts in the mission of forensic science and crimes and the related mission of crime scene investigation and the mission of law enforcement.
Yeah.
It's been transformative. So last week I did several things. First thing is I testified in a murder trial in Nevada. It's Nevada versus Rico Rivas. It involves a homicide of a woman by her husband during Christmas time. And that was a crime reconstruction, crime scene analysis case, basic stuff. And then we did evidence viewing remotely in the state of Connecticut. And then we did an evidence viewing on site in the state of Kansas in a sexual assault case. In each one of these cases, and Melanie knows this very well, one of the first things we do when we intake a case is we look at what's called a probable cause document, the probable cause warrant for arrest. I like to look at the probable cause warrant because it includes the criminal charges the person has been accused of, all right? And then it includes the behavior and evidence that they have that supports those charges. And that is the guiding document for law enforcement and prosecutors in these cases. And that relates directly to death investigation and crime scene investigation. Melanie, can you tell us about, just give us your experience so everybody knows your experience to date with death investigation and how you conceive the difference between death investigation and homicide investigation, as we talked about today.
Yeah, that was a tough one when you picked the topic for this.
I didn't really
know. It was because I didn't know what avenue to go in or where exactly we were going to go with my own experiences. So we were talking about Please Bring Me Home, which is cold cases of missing people. So there isn't a death investigation that is done for anything. When it's a missing person, they might knock on a few doors and things like that. They might file a report if you're lucky, because a lot of the time they won't even do that, dependent on your age. But there's no investigation done. And I was saying to Turvey that it would be beneficial to anybody who is filing a missing persons case to start investigating it as some kind of disappearance or a possible death, right? Instead of just knocking on doors saying, hey, have you heard from so-and-so or anything like that. So my experience with the death investigation is, well, there isn't one in a lot of the cases that I'm working with Please Bring Me Home. It doesn't exist.
No, exactly right. So this is the issue. When you have a missing persons case, there is no criminal charge at all. And it finally clicked with me. It took me many years for this to click with me. But what I've realized is we work many cases, many homicide investigations, many death scenes where law enforcement come in, they touch everything, they use the bathroom, they don't pay attention to obvious bloody footwear impressions, they don't pay attention to obvious evidence of behavior that we would collect and document, and they don't seem to care about transfer evidence. And I'm always railing against this. And they're always thinking, why are you being so critical? Why do you care about that? And I finally realized why we have this problem. The problem is that law enforcement is trained and punished into a place where they investigate a crime based on the statute that's being violated. They either have a report of a crime or they have a preconceived idea of a crime that may have occurred, and they go into a scenario thinking only about the criminal statutes that apply and what evidence they need to collect. For example, I just worked a case where there's evidence that was in a drawer and they were investigating an allegation of sexual assault. You have a bedroom, some evidence in a drawer with some sex toys, and some other evidence in the room, clothing, bedding, cigarettes in an ashtray, drinks, things like that. And they collected only some underwear and some sex toys in other parts of the house. They collected nothing else, even though it obviously has a value for the reconstruction. As a forensic scientist, what I care about is reconstructing the crime and figuring out what happened, figuring out all the behavior. And then based on that reconstruction, I help determine what criminal charges might apply given the total picture of evidence, right? Law enforcement don't do that. Not only do they not do that, they are punished by prosecutors if they stray from the criminal charges into something else. And that's the big disconnect, the big problem. And that translates into death investigation versus homicide investigation. Death investigation is when you have a death and you don't know what happened. Like it's going to be a potential, every death is a potential homicide, suicide, accidental, natural causes. Every death is a potential one of those. And you don't know the answer until you've done the total crime reconstruction and you have an autopsy report that's an integrated forensic assessment. But if somebody decides up front that it's a suicide, that means there's no criminal charges to worry about. That means they don't got to collect evidence. That means they don't got to worry about it. And that's the problem right there in a nutshell. If you believe there are no criminal charges that apply, you think you don't have a job to do. But let's talk about femicide for a second, because the death investigation implies you have a death, you need to investigate it because you don't know what happened. Law enforcement decide what happened up front, and they investigate thusly. Tell us about your experience with femicides in this way, because this is really critical. I want to make this point from multiple perspectives.
Yeah, I think when we talk about, and Melanie was talking about that, this idea that when someone disappears, what's going to be the hypothesis, no? What's going to be the primary objective? And when you think about it and you go to femicide, when you have someone like a woman who died in a violent way, it can be an accident, it can be in suicide, it can look like a suicide. You need to actually investigate as a death, as a homicide, as a femicide.
Yeah, potentially.
And if there's a kid who actually, like, let's think, dies in a supposedly accident in a pool, you need to investigate that as a homicide too.
Potential homicide.
But if you think about it, it's like if someone disappeared, you need to investigate that person is alive still.
Yeah,
that's the primary target. The problem is the bureaucratic part, because if that person is alive, there's no actually a crime
per se,
unless
they're being held against their will.
Yeah, so it's a good idea to actually investigate that case like they were alive. But the problem is that doesn't activate any mechanisms inside the police. That's right. Because that's like, how do you do an investigation of someone who's alive and there's no crime involved at first glance? But it actually is the problem in itself is the bureaucratic system that create these numbers. And this is an old problem.
Yeah.
Since the 1980s, we start attacking the government in ways like, we need to give us more transparency. We need to give us more numbers. And that transformed the government in a statistical, model.
Statistical and economic model.
An economic model.
We have this crime, we have this much money for these crimes. Respond to that, Melanie, the bureaucratic process, because I think you've confronted that a number of times, but in a very real way. The bureaucratic model, the lack of activation of resources. Talk to us about that and how that's affected your work in Canada.
Well, they don't want us anywhere near their cases. When I came on board with Please Bring Me Home, it was this idea that I had that I was going to be helping. I was going to assist and be somebody that has the time to do so, because I know the officers have a lot of things on their plate. Some of these things fall to the side. And I had this idea that this organization for missing people would be accepted amongst the services, because we were just trying to help. We were very careful about the legalities. We weren't overstepping. We're not doing anything we're not supposed to be doing, but we keep getting shut down every time. And we are following leads and we are coming to areas of interest and things like that. And it just seems that they don't want anything to do with it, because then we are, as Turvey and I talked about today, we are basically stirring a pot. We're bringing up issues that have happened in the early stages of these investigations, and it's showing that they're not doing their job. or that there's just a disconnect with the service and the crime or the missing person altogether. They just want it to go away.
So by the Please Bring Me Home function is to help find missing people. Sometimes the missing people are alive and there's no crime. Sometimes the missing people are dead and there's a body.
And here they have to be considered a cold case. It has to be a case that is no longer being looked at. We do have a lot of people that reach out looking for or asking us for help with someone who has went missing recently. And I'm talking within weeks or months when they reach out to us. Now, we can't get involved with that because it's still considered an active police investigation. The thing I did learn here, though, is that even some of the cold cases, if they keep them just open as a missing person, they can justify that as it's still being active. So they can tell us that we can't look at this case at all because they consider it still to be active. So these cases get closed and put away. Nobody's looking at them, and they just allow you to believe they're still being looked at.
So it's theatrical. This classification of each person is theatrical.
And
yes.
And I will ask you both, what's the criteria to put a case into the cold case category?
The first question that needs to be asked is, where does this concept of the cold case? Well, there's two concepts that I think are based on movies and television that aren't real, and they serve a very bureaucratic purpose. The first is this concept of the golden 48 hours.
Yeah, like we
only have 48 hours, and after that, you can't solve it. Why?
But then, in the other hands, they say you need to wait 48 hours to start
doing it.
The
whole thing is designed to create an environment where work does not need to be done. What I would say is this: the 48-hour notion, that's nonsense. I mean, I've solved cases by coming in weeks after the fact, or months after the fact, or years after the fact, by just giving attention. What they mean is their agency has a bureaucratic requirement that if you don't solve that case within 48 hours or 72 hours or whatever it is for your agency, they're going to start assigning you other cases. What it's an admission of, in my view, is that law enforcement doesn't like to work more than one case at a time. And in larger agencies, if you don't have the skill to work more than one case at a time, you know that's a problem. We got 33 open cases right now in my agency, my company. 33. Not a problem. This is the thing, this idea of the 48 hours, that's manufactured by people who are doing economic evaluations, by bureaucratic evaluations. And what they're saying is, after that, well, if we don't do it, then that's not our fault because it wasn't easy to solve. Who the heck decided that? And the idea of a cold case is the idea of a case that means it's inactive. In other words, there isn't an investigator who's doing things on a regular basis. But what they want is to, when they say they, I mean law enforcement and the economic bureaucratic powers that be, they want to put that case into limbo so that anybody who comes along, it's legal limbo. So anybody who comes along, they can say, oh, it's still active. Well, are you working on it? No. How is it active if you're not working? How, if it's a cold case? This idea of a cold case is non-existent. When I give training on this, I say, treat it like it just happened yesterday and you'll do way better.
It also restricts the family's access to information from law enforcement if they keep it like that. So you can't, like a Freedom of Information Act or something like that, it keeps those notes and investigative, like the track record of what they've actually done on the case, they don't have to hand it over. If it's considered cold case, it's still technically active. So you don't have to produce that and show the family you're not doing anything.
No, that's totally true. And this is the problem, right? The problem is it's about restricting the access of information to the public, to everyone else. But that keeps and maintains the illusion that something's being done. Because they create this opaque wall of law enforcement where you can't peer to the other side. You can't look at the other side and see what's being done. And on the other side of that wall, there's nothing being done. There's nobody working on it. But
in our organization,
they need the legal barrier to prevent anyone else from having access to the material to know what's not being done.
That's right. And in our organization, we have a system set up. So we have the investigators, our investigators, investigative team members looking at the cases, and I'm the head of that. So they send me monthly reports usually, and it's on everything they've done, every tip they followed up on, any lead that we're going into, and we produce that. We send it to the law enforcement detective in charge of those files. And I don't even know how many times they followed up on any of it. Probably not. And it's good lead. We're doing all the footwork and bringing new leads, which they want, they say, but nothing ever gets done. They just leave it. They just throw it in the file and close it again.
Yeah, that happens a lot. So the concept of a 48 hours is not a real thing.
Yeah.
The concept of a cold case is not a real thing. And the concept of a missing person case is create this unit. I believe firmly, and this is in law enforcement. Anybody who works in law enforcement will tell you this. Going to missing persons is a punishment. They put people in missing persons as a punishment. It's not where people who are good, competent, or ethical go. It's where you put somebody that you politically don't like because there's nothing for them to do. And they don't teach people how to investigate missing persons cases. They go knock on a few doors, they make a few phone calls, and the rest of their time is waiting and just compiling numbers. And the reality is a missing person case has to be treated like anything else. There was when the first guide to crime scene investigation came out in 1997 or 98, it was called, on the front of it was by DOJ or NIJ, National Institute of Justice, the part of the DOJ in the United States. They came up with this crime scene guide. It's been updated every 5-6 years. The first one on the front, it said in bold letters, every scene, every time. And what that meant was you process the crime scene the same way every time, no matter what, because you don't know whether it's a homicide or not. And you have to treat every death as though it's a potential homicide, because until the medical examiner comes back with their finding, you don't really know for sure what it is.
Mhm.
But nowadays, we have law enforcement agencies on the day, without any full evidence, without any investigation, without any real information, declaring a case a homicide, a suicide, or an accident, and using that to pressure the medical examiner to come their way.
Mhm.
And I think people have this idea that it's a very simple, cut and dry process that's uncomplicated and not political. The reality is it's very political. There's a case that I just completed my work on in Illinois, the Samantha Hare case. I've been working on this case for a while. And without getting into the findings in my report, I can tell you what happened that's logistically necessary to understand for our purposes today. You have a 911 dispatcher, and she's found shot in the head under very bizarre circumstances with her boyfriend and her naked in the home. The boyfriend is not welcome there. They broke up a couple of weeks ago. He doesn't belong in the house. He's there with his new gun. That's not the gun that was used to kill her, but he's in the house for 15 hours going through her phone and sitting there drinking alcohol. And then she winds up dead, naked in a room a couple minutes after she wakes up. The police announce on the doorsteps of her apartment before the body's right after the body's removed, I think, that it's a suicide. The medical examiner does not come back with a ruling in that case for a full year. It takes a year, and there is nothing but problems between the agents, between law enforcement and the medical examiner's office, and pressure is clearly being applied. And part of that pressure was the press conference to make them say, okay, you want to go against us? This is what you're going to have to say. You're going to have to come out and say something, because we're taking this position right now. It is very political. It is not the first time I have seen that happen, and I'm sure I'm going to see it again. Melanie, you want to respond to that? Because I know you did some assistance on that, some intake assistance for me.
Yeah, on that case, because everybody involved fell under the law enforcement umbrella somewhere in that case, they made that claim, I would say, before they even got there.
And I forgot to mention, right, that the boyfriend was a detective with the police department. So when he called 911, these tapes are public. He requested certain people come to the crime scene.
Right.
His buddy. He named the people he wanted to come process the crime scene.
That's right. And he also was very specific as to what happened. He made it, that in his opinion, it was a suicide, and he made that public. Like you said, that's public knowledge. You can listen to the call on your website. But it was declared before that. And then so many issues, like you said, forensically, it didn't make any sense. The story kept changing. Nothing added up. And then you have the year elapsed for that to come forward. The whole thing was a mess, and you could tell it was just everybody wanted to believe it was one thing, and we wanted to support that narrative, and you could see it through the whole case.
And the pressure was put on everyone to conform to that narrative, multi-agencies. And the bottom line is they're happy to do it as long as it doesn't result in a homicide or responsibility or anything. The investigation wasn't really even done. They left tons of evidence behind at the scene. They ignored tons of contextual stuff. They ignored the inconsistencies in everyone's statements. They ignored the clear collusion and all this stuff was very well documented, but they ignored it. And you could see how uncomfortable the medical examiner was because it took him so long to come out with a finding. It took forever. That is not the norm, and that is not acceptable practice. So this idea, we have this fantasy idea about how death investigation works. Can you, before you started working with Please Bring Me Home, before you started doing casework with me, can you tell me your perspective of how you thought it would work and how you thought your contribution would be beneficial?
How I thought a death investigation would work?
Yeah.
We were talking about this before. I had it in my mind that there was a very logical process that would happen. Something would happen, a crime would occur, police officer shows up. We probably secure the scene and we go through everything. This is what taking every piece of evidence, anything that may not seem like it could fit this crime, but taking it because it could very well be a variable of something. Not the opposite. And what I believed was the complete opposite of what I'm seeing. I'm seeing that they are going in, they have an idea of what happened, they've been told what happened, or they have a charge that they're looking to lay, and they only look for the things that are going to support that narrative, which is not at all how I thought something would, how that process would go. I thought they would look for what actually happened.
There's another aspect too, though. It gets deeper, and you mentioned it a little bit, and Aurelio and I experience it, I would say, almost every day. And that is that not only is it the opposite of I had the same fantasy. I want to just tell you right now, when I got involved, I thought, I'm going to help. I'm going to do good. And I think most police officers, when they join, they got the same idea. I'm going to go protect innocent people. I'm going to arrest bad guys. I'm going to find out what happened, and I'm going to facilitate justice, right?
Yeah.
And that's a noble public service commitment, I think. And I think all of us come to the criminal justice professions with this idea. But because of the bureaucratic nature of the prosecution and the way that and I want to make this clear, law enforcement are in the same boat, kind of. They get pushed around by the prosecution in a way that prevents them from being creative, that prevents them from thinking, that prevents them from collecting things that they know that the prosecutors don't want them to collect, from asking questions that go beyond the statute.
Yeah.
Right? The prosecution gets a theory of a crime, or the police get a theory of a crime, and anything that goes beyond that is punished. And that extends to the assistance of external examiners, of external investigators. Aurelio and I, we work for the defense, obviously, in many cases. We've helped get many innocent people acquitted. We've helped get innocent people out of prison over the years. But also, we've worked for the police many times. And you know what we experience every single fucking time? Every single time when we show them what happened and we help get justice, do you think that results in happiness and collegiality? No. They get embarrassed, they get angry, and they retaliate.
Yeah.
They do not like at all to be shown that they've done a bad job. And they do not like anyone else to come from the outside and help them and make the case and inform their case. They don't want anyone to be seen to know better than them, to have answers that they don't have. And instead of welcoming assistance, they punish it. They threaten it. Aurelio, tell me about your experience with that, because I know I've got my experience, but I know you've got yours. It's one of the reasons why I wanted you to talk.
When I start doing this work, I was thinking, like, because I start working in jail.
Yep.
And you start doing interviews, you realize most of the people that are there because there are previous circumstances. They're too poor, or they were not even involved in the crime, but they were in a vulnerable group that it can be easily targeted to.
A lot of them are illiterate, you told me. Remember, they get them to sign documents that they don't even know how to read.
Yeah, but then you think, oh, maybe it's because judges have some biases against these people. That's why they're in jail. But the problem, as you guys says, starts in the crime scene. This idea of this is what happened, and then the rest of the journey is about to prove that. Creates this. Just think about it. Every prisoner, every person that is in jail is actually a political prisoner. Because if you think the definition of political prisoner is that there's no actual justice, that the people who are in jail is because there's been someone take a decision that is beyond the realm of what they're supposed to do because they are from the state. And what they did is, like, let's think, the governor can say stuff like, oh, there's a lot of robbery in that part of the city. and the citizens are very angry about that. Let's put more police there. And we need to arrest people to create the, this notion of we're doing something. And then they go and do this arrest. But also the forensic people do the same. They think, oh, if I put this in my report, I will lose my job. So politically, it's better to do this other one.
Yeah, not even lose your job. You don't have to lose your job. You might lose overtime.
Yeah.
The way that police and forensic people are punished is you take away their overtime. Overtime, most people don't get, their base pay is not very good. It's shitty as hell.
Can we say that every cold case is a cold case because there's no investigation?
That's right. Then they admit that, but they don't put two and two together and realize what they're admitting.
Yeah.
No one realizes what that admits.
So every cold case can be potentially a human rights violation, because if someone who actually knows what he's doing and check the file can do a report saying you need to investigate this, and you didn't do it.
And you didn't do it.
It's not about, oh, I have this new trade, I have this new clue. And no, I see it in TV. No, you actually didn't interview like the daughter. You didn't go to the work and do.
We got a case right now where we had a rape case right now in Kansas where they didn't interview the outcry witness.
No,
the outcry witness is the person that the victim originally reports the crime to.
Yeah.
And they're not reporting to the outcry witness because he doesn't help them. They're not interviewing him. Just basic interviews that you think would need to get done. Yeah. That's a really great point. But I don't think most people understand that that's an admission. When law enforcement say this is a cold case, what you're saying is we haven't applied resources.
Yeah.
The problem is the public has the fantasy that you're talking about, Melanie, where they have this idea of how it already, that all these things, and we've done everything we know how to do. That's the problem. You don't know how to do the basic stuff. You don't know how to do basic criminal investigation. You only know how to investigate the statute and not the context or the full picture of the evidence or the crime scene. And when we give training in crime scene investigation or crime scene analysis or profiling, they say, oh, this will be good for that. This will be good for that. They never think in terms of this whole model needs to be applied to every case so that we can mine the case for information and prove whether a crime even occurred.
Yeah. So if we think in these terms, victims are also political.
Yes.
She's a victim because the state is not doing what's supposed to do. If there was another person with money or with certain type of
skin color,
we will actually do it. That's a political victim, and someone who's in jail or is outside jail is also political. But we use this word like it was very delicate and it was only applying in certain cases, but it's not, because we're talking about public policies. This is a systemic problem.
And like there's the notion, the false notion, Melanie, that you were mentioning, that all of the avenues and leads have been exhausted. I've never seen that case. Yeah. I keep getting asked, when I get asked by a detective, what's the hardest case? I'm like, I've never seen a case where all the leads have been exhausted. If you're telling me we've done everything, I've never seen that case.
Never.
So, Melanie, when you get these cases, let's do a grade between 1 and 10. What's the level of investigation you see in your missing person cases? Negative what?
Negative 14.
Oh, God, that's horrible.
But I will touch on what you were just saying, because it does depend on the person themselves. If it's a family that maybe has money and they're putting more resources into that, they will get the time and the coverage for those types of things, for searches, or just getting the word out in the media. You see a lot of that here for certain, within certain communities and vulnerable demographics. I find like most of the cold cases that I've been looking at, they are people who suffer from drug addiction, or they're homeless, maybe prostitute, and but we don't have many of those cases personally. Yeah. We have looked into them ourselves. We're not actively working them because our organization, you have to reach out as a family member of the missing person.
Yeah.
And then we go through an intake process. Right. So we are well aware of how many missing and murdered Indigenous females and males we have here, but they're not actively our cases. So within our cases, it is a lot of vulnerable demographics, like you said, a lot of I find that the police push it off as a drug overdose, or he's probably, he probably overdosed and he's over there, or ran away, or he's in another, wherever. Like, as if they're an adult, they don't do anything. They just say, well, adults leave on their own all the time.
So Aurelio and I just gave a little seminar to journalists in Latin America. And one of the things I mentioned, and I'll mention it here because I think it's so important, you just brought up this very important issue, Melanie, and that is that when there is attention on a case, it gets more, when there's media attention or public outcry or public interest because of the media, the case gets more resources from law enforcement.
Yes.
That is automatic. And that can happen organically because of cultural bias, like the person has a lot of money, they're white, they're pretty, or the images associated with the case are very good, so they want to keep playing them. You know that. So if the media likes the case for whatever reason, they're going to keep doing it. And those cases tend not to be the ones related to indigenous populations, poor people, drug addicts, homeless, or prostitutes.
Yeah.
Those don't get our attention. And by the way, those are the groups that are targeted by serial rapists and serial murderers.
Right.
By the way,
No,
and that's on purpose.
And that's you asked me before about femicide, and that's the thing in Mexico. I don't know what's happening in Canada and United States, but when someone disappears or when someone doesn't show up for a couple of days, and you go and report it, they need to understand the context. You know, in Mexico, we lose women every day, so they need to treat this like someone who disappears in Mexico.
Yeah.
They cannot treat it like someone disappears. So adults can go, no, this is a woman who's being threatened by someone or has some problems with the law before.
Yeah.
That means they're more vulnerable.
Yes.
That means they're most potential. That
doesn't mean you do less. It means you do more.
You do more.
That's
They do like, oh man, come on. No. So the context is very important to do this political
That's a really great
pressure to the police.
No.
Actually, they call it here gender alert. Gender alert means there's some public recognition that in this area, absence of someone can be interpreted as some crime. So they need to actually do something about it because they don't have the discretion, the discretionality to stop doing it because of the context. If there's enough people disappearing in Canada, you need to actually treat Canada like that's a country where people disappear.
Yeah.
So you need to treat this as a crime.
And before I want to let you respond to that, Melanie, but very quickly, before I lose this thought because I'm old, the idea is that every case has to be investigated before you know what it is.
Yeah.
That's the first thing. That's the way that I think all of us here thought that that's the model. You investigate to find out what happened. You don't decide what happened and investigate to prove it or to stack the evidence to curate the evidence that direction. That was in the 90s when they came out with this. That's how I was trained. You don't decide what happened until you do your investigation. Investigate first and then decide what charges or what crime may or may not have occurred. In the crime scene in the crime scene investigation guidelines, it says that. Death investigation protocols, it says that. In the femicide protocols, it says that. But nowadays, we have many investigators who say, well, I know it's a suicide, so I don't have to do an investigation. If you haven't done an investigation, you don't know it's a suicide. You can't put the cart before the horse.
Yeah.
First, you investigate, then you decide. You don't decide and then construct an investigation. I know that in Mexico, for example, if they don't like somebody, if they have a problem with somebody, they'll put evidence on them so they can hold them for 48 hours while they go and investigate them and try to build a case against them. And sometimes, as we found out in Tabasco, that process actually can last for years.
For years, yeah.
Years they can be in jail without having any charges against them.
Yeah, they can actually do that. And
our DEA does that too, by the way. And our Border Patrol does that with immigrants. Like this idea, I was talking to Paul yesterday, and he made the comment of, well, the illegal, but you go with the problem is with the illegal criminal immigrants. And I'm like, yes, but illegality is something that's established by the courts. It is if you're doing something illegal, that means you've been convicted of a crime.
Yeah.
If you have not been convicted of a crime, you are not a criminal, and nothing you're doing is illegal yet. You may be suspected of a crime, but that's not enough that you shouldn't be being held for years or months as a political prisoner at the border because somebody thinks maybe you committed a crime.
Yeah, exactly.
While they're building a case or doing nothing. And then ultimately, a lot of these people get released because they didn't commit a crime. They weren't illegal. Illegal is something for the court to decide. It's a court determination. And the Constitution says innocent is the innocence is the presumption. The presumption of innocence is paramount. So if there's a presumption of innocence, you shouldn't be jailing people for suspicion without a hearing, without attending to their rights and calling them illegal. You can't call someone an illegal immigrant until you've established that what they were doing is illegal.
Exactly.
There's a whole process that's required. And if you were white, then I guess you would get that.
Yeah, of course.
That presumption. But if you're brown, you don't. And in the United States, our Constitution applies to anyone who is in the United States.
Yeah.
Anyone, not the citizens, but the people. Our Constitution discriminates between people and citizens, and it talks about the Constitution applying to people, not just citizens, but all people in the borders. So, Melanie, I apologize for that, but I wanted you just to respond to what we've just been talking about. I apologize for consuming so much time. I just didn't want to lose the thought.
Because you're old.
Because I'm old. Let's make that very clear.
What I was going to touch on is one thing. There's I like how you called it a fantasy, like this fantasy of what we thought happened or how the things should go. And one of the startling realizations I came to is that there isn't a protocol in many of our services here for reporting missing people. So the police aren't even, not only do they not treat it as a possible death investigation where they do an investigation, there's not even a protocol on how to investigate when somebody says somebody's missing. So what are they going to do? That it's not even in the book. They're not going to do anything. And that was alarming to me. I had no idea. I thought there was a full protocol and what they would do, and then where they would go from that. And
I remember I asked you that. I said we were like a couple of years ago. We were having a conversation, and I said, "What's the protocol?" Because we were going to do some collaboration on these issues.
Right.
Find somebody to tell you in Canada what the protocol is for the missing persons investigation.
And so they don't have one. And so where I started with that was the book that they train new recruits with at the police college. I looked through it. I looked through all how to report. What do we do for a missing person? I have a law enforcement, the book that they keep, and they will normally keep it on them because it's got all the protocols for everything. I went through that front and back. Nothing for protocol for a missing person. Again, like I said previously in another podcast, they do have the Amber Alert, right? We're all aware that there is a difference when it's a child that is reported missing. I'm speaking mostly about an adult. Somebody comes forward and says somebody over the age of 18 is missing. So there's nothing there because they are allowed to leave at their own free will when they're that age, right? So then I went further because I thought, well, maybe each service has their own set of protocols.
Right, that's a possibility.
So I called services, and I also asked officers whom I've known for a really long time.
Yeah.
And they said, I went and looked, we don't have anything. And I know we don't have anything on that service, and we also don't have it on that service. So the smaller services, I'm not talking about our CMP or OPP. I didn't look into that. These are the smaller regional services. There's nothing there, nothing to guide them to do an investigation on that.
And the interesting part about that is, let's start from there. Okay, we've just established they don't have protocols for doing these investigations, at least that are not written. Okay, and if it's not written, it's not a protocol. It doesn't exist. And so that means they don't have, so there can be no transparency or accountability because there's nothing written down about what they got to do. They can kind of do whatever they want. Okay, so let's start there. So then let's help them by giving them a protocol or teaching them what to do. They don't want it.
No.
They do not want it, because if you actually follow a real protocol, you have a good chance of finding a homicide that they didn't know about. Now you've just created a case. Now you've just required resources. Now you're requiring effort and attention. And that's not being a friend, that's being a problem. Respond to me about that, Aurelia, because that kind of gets back to what we were talking about before.
Well, what happened here in Mexico and also a lot of parts of Latin America is that when we talk about protocols, they, in the first, like 20 years ago, when we start talking about protocols, the police were saying, no, protocols is just bureaucracy, because they're doing the real thing. The real thing on the street. On the street. And you scientists want your protocols to, to slow everything down.
Yeah.
And
we need to move fast.
We need to move fast. We don't have time for those things. And then they changed it and say that the protocol was demanding too much. And they don't have the personnel, or they don't have the time,
or the budget.
And now they're saying that protocols now are okay, but also you cannot demand us to do in each case because we have too much cases.
And that's fair.
Yeah, that's fair, but that goes against the right of the people to have access to justice.
And access to justice is a key idea here, but I want to just say this, just to my law enforcement friends and colleagues out there. I totally understand that you are understaffed. I totally understand that you are undertrained. I totally understand that you are under budgeted. I get all that. If you want more staff, if you want more training, if you
Say
want
it.
more budget, say it.
In the report.
Come out and say it in your
Yeah.
goddamn report.
Yeah.
And stop going public and pretending to be a
Yeah.
hero that's doing everything. Don't go into court and say you're the expert and know everything. Don't go into a courtroom and pretend you did everything. Don't go into court and attack the people who are trying to fucking help you.
Yeah.
When we go in there and we are critical of what you didn't do, and we are demonstrating the limitations of what you have in terms of training and in terms of your capacity, we're not your enemy. We're the lifeline. You need to back us up. Come forward and back us up, or you're never going to get the training. You're never going to get the budget, because people are going to think that you're doing everything right already.
Yeah.
Quit pretending that everything's okay, because all of us know it's not. If you want to help your profession, if you want to help your profession advance and get better and do more, stop lying and saying everything is going great and we did everything we could. You know you didn't. I know you didn't. We all know you didn't. The courts know you didn't. Quit pretending to the public that you did. We're helping you. We're trying to help. We're the only ones saying what's true. If you want the budget, if you want the training, if you want the resources, admit the limitations. On your report, admit we were unable to do this because we couldn't get the budget.
Yeah.
We were unable to do this because we lacked the manpower.
Yeah.
But that also means your findings are less certain. That's the compromise.
Yeah.
Your findings are less certain. We know that.
No problem.
That's why we're going into court and saying, hey,
Yeah.
yeah, we know you don't have these things
Yeah.
that you've already admitted to. And that means your results are not as certain. That means your results are not as complete. We're fucking trying to help you. Quit causing problems. Go ahead. Melanie, you had something you wanted to add, I can tell.
No, I didn't.
No. I don't want to add to that.
I like where you went with that. But what I would add to that is that just in my own experience with, like I said, with the cold case, I don't see a lot of the investigation. I don't see the notes. I don't see what happened within the service. But working cases with you, I very quickly saw the limitations that I had no idea existed. And still working cases all the time with you, I'm sitting down, I'm looking at it, I'm like, where is this interview? Why wouldn't you have done this? But again, stop writing in your report, we reached out to so-and-so, we couldn't get a hold of them, end of note. Like, there has to be more. Just say that you couldn't do it. You didn't have the resource. You ended your shift. You'll go back. I don't know. Just do something and say it.
Be honest. Be honest.
Be honest about it.
Yep.
That's right.
There's a question here from Alex Marquez. It's in Spanish. Aurelio, you want to handle that, please?
Yeah, they're asking basically if the numbers in Canada are similar to Mexico. And well, Melanie told us, but I think there's a very big problem, especially with Indigenous women and Indigenous girls disappearing in Canada each year.
There's no database.
The problem is there's no database. In Mexico, we have problems with the database, but there's been a international and national attention. Mm-hmm. So we have some numbers. We're talking about 100,000 people disappear that we don't know if there's part of the 40,000 bodies that we have without, their identities.
So that's another limitation. So
yeah.
A couple years ago, 2018, was it?
Yeah.
We found in Guadalajara that the state was taking dead bodies, and instead of doing autopsies, they were putting them in refrigeration vans and leaving them in communities uninvestigated. And I'm not talking about one or two.
No, but I mean, Canada has almost the same population in the whole country that Mexico City and some Ciudad Juarez.
Yeah.
So, but you're losing 40 Indigenous women each year.
Yeah.
That's a lot.
That's a lot.
And
they don't have a good database.
They're not.
No.
So of course they're not in the same situation as Mexico, or maybe they're pretending better than us.
I think they're pretending better.
See, I pushed that issue a little bit when I started with Please Bring Me Home, because I wanted to know what the database was and where the numbers were coming from. So we did look into it a lot within our own organization to find out a more accurate amount of numbers, because what I found was there is no database. There is and there isn't. Like, let's be real. There are a database, but the numbers are not reflecting what is actually happening. And what I came to find out is that a lot of the cases of the Indigenous females that I was looking into just personally, they went missing off a major highway. And what happens is they lose track of her after they cross into the US. So when I started reaching out to across the US, trying to figure out, okay, do you know about this person? Is this person flagged as missing in your state? And they would say, well, I don't know. We don't talk to Canada and we don't exchange the information. So the numbers are lost. They just don't, they don't put them up.
No, that's very fair. I want to go back to Aurelio's point, and I really appreciate that because the international problem is very big, the lack of communication.
Yeah.
And to your point, and I think I want to make this very clear. You correct me if I'm wrong. To your point is the communication is totally possible if they wanted to do it.
Absolutely, it is.
Okay.
Yeah.
Communication is possible.
Yes. When we say we have a missing person, we have a description of a missing person. One of the first things that Nick, the executive director, and myself would do, we would go on to the unidentified database in the States and in Canada, wherever the line was, because it's Niagara Falls. There's some places that we are searching to see if we can get a match on an unidentified body. We're
Right.
looking at the state's bodies as well, like their descriptions, they're missing people. So we're doing that, but nobody wants to have the conversation. So it takes somebody specifically hired to do that job, going through each posting, matching descriptions and making those phone calls. But you call somewhere in the States and they're like, we don't want anything to do with it. I sent multiple emails of a missing person that I matched. We found her. We were amazed that we found her, and they wanted nothing to do with it. It was a missing girl in Florida, and they just said, nope, we closed that case. Well, you have a person that matches this identical, but they don't want to have the conversation.
So there's a lack of interest in actually doing the work and having the
Of course.
communication because they don't want to know homicide.
Right, then it would be a homicide, exactly.
So Aurelio brought up an issue that I think needs to be covered, and it's an issue that gets missed a lot. In Mexico and Latin America, there are a lot of places where you find mass graves, lots of bodies buried. Between sometimes it's 5, sometimes it's 500. This is not a small problem, but they're very good at identifying the mass graves. They're very good at cataloging the bodies that are in there, but they're not good at identifying the remains or investigating how they got there. What I find forensic anthropology to be a great resource if only they would actually do it.
Yeah.
And the actual work doesn't stop with, oh, we found a body and we got everybody out and we put them in a box or a bag. Great. Now, who are they and how'd they get there? Nobody wants to answer those questions. Those questions are completely ignored. And in Mexico, like I said, a couple of years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, we had the issue of finding reefer vans in communities full of dead bodies that had been submitted to the Attorney General's office for autopsy, and no autopsy was performed, no identification was performed, and they put the vans in the community and then abandoned them, hoping that nobody would notice. And of course, the reefer vans would fail, and then the smell would attract people, and it was not one, it was dozens.
Yeah.
Dozens of vans full of dead bodies. And each one of those represents a missing person. And if you identify that case as a homicide and identify the person, now your numbers just went up. So they're literally just hiding the bodies.
Yes.
Literally hiding the bodies. And I don't think we're that different in the States in what we do. I think the numbers are lower because there's way more accountability in the States for certain things. But in other countries, it's even worse. And what I'm trying to say is I fear we're heading that direction. I fear that unless law enforcement finds some fortitude and speaks up about the limitations of what they're able to do and stops prosecutors from prosecuting cases with bad evidence and admits their limitations, we're going to head in that direction where the forensic investigation is going to become purely and entirely theatrical. And I don't want to go there. I want to stop that before it happens. Death investigation is a serious business. It requires a complete and total total integrated forensic approach, from crime scene to autopsy to the victimology to context. All that stuff has to be done. All of it, every time. From even just identifying the body, even just identifying how they got to the place where the body was found. We are headed to this in the United States to a very theatrical place where Mexico is already at and getting worse. I'd like to see it get better. That's what I'd like. A closing thought from you, Aurelio, on that.
No, I was just thinking that we need to think these problems in regional approach, because yes, of course there's different countries, but I mean, this is the same place.
Yeah, we're all on the same continent.
And of course, crime is not like, oh no, this is United States. We don't do this here. No, we're talking about criminals, and we're talking about governments who has some kind of complicity with this. So that means the public policies in Canada and United States and Mexico, they have some kind of agreement to let some things happen and other ones not. So Of course, there's disappearance of indigenous women in Canada. Of course, United States is where most of the indigenous women that disappear in Canada go to be exploited. You know, of course, there's a relationship between Mexico and all these people who are being killed and in these mass graves. Of course, there's a relationship. The problem is that we think they're different, and they're not. We need to see this in a more international perspective.
All right, perfect. Thank you, Aurelio. Melanie, some closing thoughts from you. I really appreciate your perspective on these issues.
I was just going to say, I really hope that we go in a direction where we utilize the databases that do exist and accurately and have more communication. Like you said, it's a problem everywhere. We need to have more communication to figure out, not to figure it out, but to problem solve and to have better communication and identify these people so they're not just missing people shoved to the side. This is a difficult topic, just because there's so many people. Like when I was going through the databases, there's so many people, so many bodies, and I'm going through one after another, and there's hundreds of them, and there was nothing done for them. There's no investigation. Who are they? Why did they end up there? What was going on? And it's just really saddening when I think about that.
Okay. For me, I'll just close by saying this. I like what you said about it's possible to do it. And I like what you said about the regional problem and communicating and making sure that we're actually doing the work. But I fear we're not rewarding that. Mm-hmm. I fear that the kind of people who work in government and in law enforcement, no matter how they start, no matter what their intentions are, they get bureaucratized.
Yeah.
And they get acclimated to the bureaucracy. They get acclimated to the notion of numbers. They get acclimated to the notion of budgets. They get acclimated to the notion of protecting the agency and protecting image instead of doing the work. So my firm belief is this. My firm belief is if there's going to be reform in death investigation, it has to come from outside the government. It has to come from people who are actually doing casework outside the government. That's why one of the reasons we're doing these podcasts is to prepare sort of ideological content for our master students. So there'll be master students watching this and hearing our conversations and seeing what we talk about. And we want them to understand that this is the value that they have. The value that you have as a new forensic professional you should be coming in not wanting to get sucked in by the bureaucracy, not wanting to get desensitized to the crimes by the numbers and by the limitations that are imposed on you, not wanting to have your work and your protocols limited and dictated by people who are not going to be held accountable. People like people who are prosecutors who are forcing you to limit your gaze down to just the statute. That's the danger. So the statute is important, but it's important for the prosecutors. But they can't know for sure what statutes apply until you've done your investigative or forensic work. So even if they're screaming at you not to do certain things, that's irrelevant. Because if people found out they were doing that, trying to influence the process, I think that this grand illusion, this fantasy of death investigation would be decimated. Mm-hmm. And that's what we need to do. We need to eradicate this death investigation fantasy that we have, that it's being done properly. We need law enforcement to step up and speak loud about what it is that's not getting done, what resources are not being applied, and about what these terms actually mean. Yeah. What it means is cases are not being investigated. Easily solvable cases are not getting resources applied to them because of overtime, because of lack of training, because of a lack of public outcry. And I'll end with this. The only way things change is through public outcry. That's why law enforcement, not the police officers on the ground, but that's why command level law enforcement hates the media, because the media creates pressure and it makes them do their job. Yeah. And when they have to do their job, it means they got to admit they weren't doing their job. It means they got to admit there are things they weren't doing. There's resources they weren't applying that they do have, and that they can apply when the stakes are high enough for them.
Yes.
When it makes law enforcement look bad, that's when they'll start doing stuff. And we need to change that. We need to have people who are doing the work for the sake of the work, because they believe in the victim, because they believe in the victim, because they believe in human rights, essentially, right? They believe that all people should have access to justice. And one of the ways we provide that is by being professional with our due diligence. I want to thank you both for joining me again this week. And Melanie, we'll see you again in a couple weeks, obviously. Aurelio, thank you for your time. I know it's valuable. If anyone has any questions or comments, please leave them. Please make them. Please reach out to us. If you want to watch this podcast again, and you didn't get the whole thing, you can catch us on Spotify or YouTube or anywhere else where podcasts are available. Thank you so much. Have a good day.